under the copper-gray sky of a forgotten war zone, where the air carried the bitter stench of burnt rubber and acrid gunpowder, 61-year-old Walter Walt Braddock found himself pressed against the rusted frame of a bullet-riddled cargo truck, its engine long dead but its body offering the only cover from the hailstorm of gunfire slicing through the narrow dirt road. The war had come not to some far-flung jungle or frozen trench, but to the outskirts of a crumbled city in a fictional Eastern European nation locked in civil war, a place so battered by conflict that maps no longer dared name its streets. Walt wasn't a soldier anymore. He hadn't worn a uniform since leaving the Army 30 years earlier after a stint as a motor pool mechanic during Operation Desert Storm. But when the U.S. had sent in a humanitarian team, he volunteered as a logistics technician, someone who could keep vehicles running and supply lines moving. No one expected much from him. He was too old, too soft-spoken, and too stubborn for modern warfare, but his hands remembered the old diesel rhythms, and he could still coax life from engines others had given up on. That morning, his convoy had been ambushed near a burned-out railway junction, and chaos swallowed order like fire eats paper. Walt had dragged a wounded young corporal behind the truck's shattered tire and tried to keep pressure on the bleeding leg until the soldier passed out from pain and blood loss, whispering about his little girl back in Missouri. Moments later, a mortar shell landed near enough to lift the world off its hinges. When Walt's hearing returned in muffled pulses, the corporal was gone, buried under dust and metal. Alone now, his ears ringing and heart thudding like a faulty carburetor, Walt dared not move. Enemy patrols combed the wreckage, boots crunching gravel just feet away. The truck's undercarriage reeked of diesel and smoke, and the metal above was hot from the sun and scorched from recent blasts. Every breath came heavy, tainted with fear and the iron scent of spilled blood. His fingers trembled, not from panic, but from the slow ache of arthritis and the weight of knowing he had once trained men to survive this. He wasn't armed, hadn't carried a weapon since '91, and wouldn't have fired even if he had. Violence wasn't his way anymore. So he waited, blending into the debris like another forgotten relic of a war nobody wanted. He thought of his wife, long gone now, and of his grandson back home, who still believed his grandpa Walt had once been a hero. He thought of the Sunday morning repairs in his garage, of Motown on the radio, of the way grease settled into the lines of his knuckles like a second skin. Walt knew machines better than people, and he knew when something was running on borrowed time. He could feel it in this moment, the fragile seconds ticking down. When a pair of enemy scouts paused just 10 feet from him, murmuring in a language he didn't know but had learned to fear, he closed his eyes and slowed his breath, willing himself to become steel and rust. A gust of wind carried the smoke away just enough to reveal his outline. One soldier turned toward him, hand on rifle, but a sudden shout from farther down the road diverted their attention, and they sprinted off toward fresh movement. Walt didn't move for nearly 20 minutes, counting each second like prayer beads, until the sound of boots faded and silence crept in like fog. He knew he couldn't stay. The sun was setting, and darkness brought its own dangers. Crawling from behind the truck, joints screaming, he surveyed the carnage. No one else had survived. He whispered an apology to the corporal and limped toward the nearby tree lean, recalling a maintenance path he'd noticed days earlier while repairing a radiator. The forest beyond was thick and tangled, but Walt remembered its shape, like the wiring diagram of an old Humvee, lines and curves etched into his brain. He moved slowly, carefully, pausing often to listen. Every crack of twig or rustle of leaves felt like thunder. But he wasn't just walking. He was reading the terrain like a road map from a time when GPS was science fiction. He found a dry stream bed and followed it, knowing it would lead downhill to the valley road. Along the way, he spotted signs of other movement. Fresh prints, broken branches, and ducked into a hollow log to let another patrol pass, their flashlights slicing through the darkness just inches above his head. He didn't breathe until their footsteps faded. Nightfall came like a velvet curtain, muffling the world, and Walt moved with the patience of a man who had nothing left to prove. His knees buckled more than once, and his breath rasped in his throat, but he pressed on. Hours passed before he spotted the faint glow of a lantern, an outpost set up by Allied forces just beyond the southern ridge. He nearly collapsed as he crossed into its perimeter, drawing startled looks from the guards. "Thought we lost everyone in that convoy," one said. Walt didn't answer. He just pointed back toward the road. "There's nothing left," he murmured. "But maybe they'll send someone for what's left of the kid." They offered him water, but he declined. He sat down on a crate, closed his eyes, and let the cold settle into his bones. In the silence, he wasn't a forgotten mechanic anymore. He was a man who had survived, not by killing, but by knowing when to move, when to hide, and when to trust the map etched in memory. The war wasn't over, but for now, he had outlived it. And somewhere, his grandson would still think of him as a hero. Not the kind with a gun, but the kind who never stopped moving forward. The sharp crack of gunfire still echoed faintly in the distance, a grim reminder that the enemy was closing in. Behind the battered chassis of the abandoned vehicle, Robert's breathing was shallow but steady. The acrid scent of burnt rubber mixed with the cold morning air, prickling his nostrils. His hands, though rough and calloused from years of manual labor, moved deftly over the remnants of a broken radio set he had found nearby. His mission had shifted, no longer just survival, but finding a way out that spared lives on both sides. Robert's eyes flicked to the narrow street ahead, where the enemy patrols continued their slow, cautious sweep. They were confident, methodical, but they lacked one key advantage: understanding of the local terrain and the resilience of an old soldier who had seen far worse. He glanced at the map sketched hastily on a torn piece of paper, a relic from an earlier patrol's discarded pack. It marked a narrow alley just beyond the derelict buildings, a route that, if timed correctly, could allow him to slip past the enemy's net. But it wouldn't be simple. The street was crawling with soldiers, and every movement risked drawing fire. Robert's mind drifted back to the lessons learned decades ago, to the times when patience and cleverness had been more valuable than brute force. He remembered his father's voice, steady and firm. "Son, sometimes the quietest step is the loudest in war." He carefully positioned himself to attach a makeshift noise-maker, a small clatter of loose metal scraps rigged to fall near the enemy's flank. The device was crude but effective. When the scraps hit the ground, the distracted soldiers would instinctively turn their attention toward the noise. As the clatter echoed, Robert slipped behind the car and moved into the shadows cast by the crumbling buildings. His heart pounded, but his face remained calm. His decades of experience told him that fear was a luxury he could not afford. Further down the alley, he spotted a rusty fire escape that led to a collapsed rooftop. If he could reach it, the vantage point would give him a moment to plan his next move. The rubble beneath his feet crunched softly as he crept forward, careful not to disturb the debris. Suddenly, a young soldier's voice rang out, sharp and questioning. Robert froze. From the corner of his eye, he saw a patrol cross the street, their boots clacking rhythmically. He ducked into a narrow doorway, the chipped paint and exposed brick offering fleeting concealment. Time seemed to stretch, each second weighed down by the threat of discovery. His thoughts wandered back to the first days of the conflict, when optimism still lingered in the air. Back then, he had been a mechanic in a quiet town, his hands skilled in fixing machines but untested in war. Now, those same hands were his only tools to survive. As the patrol passed by without noticing the faint silhouette behind the doorway, Robert exhaled softly. His plan was working, but the margin for error was razor-thin. Using the fire escape, he climbed to the rooftop, the cold metal biting into his palms. From this vantage, he could see the patrol's movements more clearly, a slow dance of shadows and flashes. He spotted a supply truck parked near the edge of the street. If he could reach it and create a small explosion, not to harm but to disorient, the distraction might give him enough time to disappear into the maze of back alleys. Robert rummaged through his worn backpack and found a few flares and an old can of fuel, remnants from a previous skirmish. Carefully, he fashioned a timed ignition device, his mind running through every detail. As he set the device near the truck's tire, he glanced toward the street. The patrol was closing in, voices louder now, footsteps quicker. He triggered the flare, retreating swiftly to a shadowed corner just as the explosion erupted in a ball of fire and smoke. The soldiers shouted, rushing to the scene, disoriented and uncertain. Robert seized the moment, darting into the labyrinth of alleyways. His boots barely made a sound on the cracked pavement. His body ached, but his will was unyielding. He knew the city's veins well, the narrow paths, the hidden courtyards, knowledge from years before the war, when he'd lived and worked here. That familiarity was his shield. As he rounded a corner, a sudden cry pierced the air. A child's voice, frightened and alone. Robert's resolve faltered for a moment. The war had already taken so much. But the sound also steeled him. This was no longer just about survival. It was about hope, about the chance to protect others. He moved quickly, slipping behind piles of debris, the enemy's shouts fading behind him. Ahead, a ruined church tower rose against the smoky sky, a silent sentinel in a world gone mad. Robert knew that reaching the tower meant safety, a place to regroup and send a message to his comrades. His hands trembled slightly, but he swallowed the fear. Every step was a victory, a testament to the quiet courage of a man who refused to be forgotten. 3 days had passed since Walt Braddock had stumbled into the Allied outpost beneath the southern ridge. His body held together by willpower and muscle memory, and while his hands had stopped shaking, the sounds of war still echoed in his mind like distant thunder trapped in a rusted barrel. The medics wanted to send him home, called him lucky, called him a survivor, but Walt wasn't ready to leave, not until he knew what had become of the rest of his convoy, the other drivers, and especially the young corporal whose name he still didn't know but whose blood was still under his fingernails. He spent his nights beneath a frayed tent, listening to the distant rumble of shellfire and the hum of generators, and each morning he walked the perimeter, inspecting vehicles, fixing what he could, like he always had, but now every wrench turn carried the weight of obligation. On the 4th day, a scout unit returned with news. An enemy encampment had been spotted in the northern ruins of a burned-out factory town. There was intel suggesting prisoners, maybe civilians, maybe Allied personnel. Walt felt something stir deep in his chest, like an old carburetor sparking to life. He asked to go with the recon team, was told no, too old, too slow, too non-essential. But when the convoy left at dawn, they found him already inside one of the trucks, sitting quiet with a toolkit on his lap and a determined set to his jaw. No one argued. They crossed desolate fields choked with charred wheat stalks and broken fences, the once fertile landscape now a graveyard of twisted irrigation lines and collapsed grain silos. The closer they came to the ruins, the tighter the silence grew. When the first shot rang out, Walt didn't duck. He slid beneath the dashboard and began repairing the radio unit that had gone dark just as they entered the red zone. Even as bullets ricocheted off the armored hull, he stayed focused, soldering wires with hands steady from decades of practice. By the time comms were restored, the firefight had moved into the factory's skeletal shell, and Walt stayed behind with the med-evac team, helping patch up wounded while explosions turned windows into shrapnel. It wasn't until the smoke cleared that the team discovered a makeshift holding cell in the factory's sub-basement. Among the 6 rescued prisoners was the corporal, emaciated, feverish, but alive. Walt sat beside his cot that night, whispering stories about carburetors and drive shafts, stories that had no place in a war zone but helped the boy sleep. The next morning, command offered Walt a flight home again. This time, he accepted. He knew his job was done, not because the war had ended, but because he had done what he came to do: protect, repair, endure. His flight out was delayed due to engine trouble, and Walt spent the delay helping the aircrew bypass a bad relay. No one told him to stop. When the plane finally lifted into the haze-filled sky, he looked out the window at the broken land below, not with sorrow, but with a quiet knowledge that even in ruin, there were still roads worth traveling. Back home, the world had moved on. The grocery store had new self-checkout lanes. His old house smelled of dust and linseed oil, and his grandson, now tall, with a deep voice, waited on the porch with a fresh can of motor oil and a story of his own about joining a trade school. Walt didn't speak much of what happened overseas. He didn't need to. In the garage, he unpacked his old tools, lined them up with practiced care, and taught his grandson how to listen to the rhythm of an engine, how to feel its pulse. The boy asked once if he ever saw combat. Walt only smiled and said, "I saw enough." But every now and then, when the wind rustled the oak trees just right or a distant car backfired like artillery, his eyes would drift to the horizon, remembering the sound of boots on gravel, the feel of dirt pressed against his back, and the way a man could survive a war without ever firing a shot. He wasn't a hero in the way movies like to show. There were no medals, no grand speeches, but he had made it home by relying on what he knew: how to fix things, how to wait, and when to move. In the end, that was enough. And as long as someone kept the engines running, as long as someone remembered the road and taught the next generation how to walk it, quietly, wisely, without violence, then the war hadn't won. Not really. The ruined church tower stood tall against the smoke-filled sky, a lonely witness to the chaos that had engulfed the city. Robert crouched behind a crumbled stone wall nearby, catching his breath. The distant rumble of artillery and sporadic gunfire were constant reminders that danger still lurked everywhere. As he scanned the broken streets, Eyes sharp despite the exhaustion, something caught his attention, a faint movement near the collapsed marketplace. A figure, barely visible through the haze, was dragging something across the rubble. Instinct told Robert to keep hidden, but curiosity, and a flicker of hope, pushed him forward. He carefully edged closer, using shadows as his shield. The closer he got, the more he realized it was a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, her face smudged with dirt and streaked with tears. She was helping a wounded man, perhaps a civilian caught in the crossfire. Their whispered voices barely audible. Robert's heart tightened. He remembered his own family, far away, and how war tore lives apart indiscriminately. Before he could step out to help, a shout echoed. Enemy soldiers had spotted the pair. Panic flashed in the woman's eyes. She glanced toward Robert, hesitation and desperation mingling in her gaze. Without thinking, Robert rose, stepping into the open. "Over here," he called softly, drawing the attention away from the woman and her companion. Bullets whizzed past, striking the rubble around him. His pulse surged, but years of survival instincts took over. Slowly, deliberately, he moved toward the nearest debris pile, using it as cover. The enemy soldiers began advancing, convinced the man who had spoken was their target. Robert seized the moment. Using a broken piece of metal, he caused a loud clang against the concrete, sending enemy soldiers scrambling in confusion. In the chaos, the woman grabbed the wounded man and fled toward an alley Robert had scouted earlier. He followed, covering their backs. Once safe, the woman introduced herself as Elena, a local nurse determined to aid the injured despite the risks. The wounded man, she explained, was a former soldier, now too weak to move alone. Robert saw in her the same determination he had, a refusal to give up even when all hope seemed lost. Together, they planned their next move, to reach the outskirts of the city where friendly forces were rumored to be regrouping. Elena handed Robert a small, worn map marked with safe routes. "You know this city," she said quietly. "We need your help." For the first time since the fighting began, Robert felt a spark of purpose beyond mere survival. This was more than just evading death. It was about saving lives, about fighting with wisdom and heart. As night fell, the three of them set off, shadows slipping through the ruins, united by a fragile hope that even in the darkest times, courage and kindness could light the way.